Hi, my name is Justin diFeliciantonio. I'm the gear editor for Tennis.com. I'm here today with Jim Courier, current Davis Cup captain and former #1 in the world. We're talking about equipment today.
Let's do it.
Wondering, you're still very close to the game today. How would you characterize the the rackets and the strings that the players are using on tour, and how do you feel they've affected the dynamics of the game?
Right. Oh, there's a lot to talk about here, Justin. I mean, I think that the rackets and the string have combined to make a pretty beautiful marriage right now. There was a period of time in the 80s when the big technology, the Wilson Profile, came to be. It was the first real thick racket that I remember, and most of the professional players couldn't control it. They couldn't play with it. It was largely a racket for amateurs. But with the advent of the co-poly strings, as the racket technology kept morphing and evolving, and various iterations of those thicker rackets were being manufactured using different types of fibers and carbons and whatnot, the string came along and it has allowed the pros to harness that power and to maximize it, and it's a large part of why we're seeing some of the shots that we see today that were just technically not possible from really gifted ball strikers back in the day before they had access to what the current players do.
So you're saying that the strings, the new polyester strings, really complement the thicker constructions that you see?
Without a doubt. I mean, the technology of the string, the data on it shows that it spins the ball at a more rapid rate, which allows players to control the ball while still swinging with great force. Amateurs will get the benefit of this as well. I tell any amateur who asks me anything about technology, I say, you know, the rackets are very important, don't get me wrong, but you're really missing out if you haven't migrated to the new co-poly strings.
You know, 20 years ago, everyone was using gut string on tour, but now, as you're saying, using strings like Luxilon, polyester strings. I mean, how does this really change the way that points are played on tour?
Well, I think that if you look at what the string allows the players to do, it allows them to take these rackets that have a ton of power, sort of nuclear power, if you'll pardon the analogy, of a Babolat type racket, which for someone like me is uncontrollable. I can't play with a Babolat racket even today, even with the string. But for players with less racket head acceleration, they're able to keep the ball and play with those rackets with very little effort, with a lot of power. So what's happened is we're seeing incredible lengths of rallies between the players. They're able to hit excellent neutralizing shots from normally defensive positions in the court, because the rackets and the strings combine to give them the ability to put the ball deep enough on their opponents with enough pace and spin to get back into a rally. Whereas before, a player playing with a traditional thin beam racket and a gut string or a nylon string would have to go for a winner, or they'd give up a weak shot, but they wouldn't be back at neutral. So it's allowing for longer points. That's one of the benefits. Maybe a slight negative to come along with this is that it's also making it virtually impossible for players to serve and volley, because it's become so much easier to pass them. So with the technology, one of the other pieces to that equation is that they've homogenized the court speed almost across all surfaces. Grass has gotten slower, hard courts have gotten slower, the indoor courts have gotten slower, closer to the clay court surface. So the serve and volley player has almost been eradicated by a combination of the court speed and then, of course, the technology of the rackets and the strings.
I've heard that from a lot of sources here, that the courts here at the U.S. Open are much slower than they were in years past. So you would agree with that estimation?
Well, I think that in years past, the outside courts in particular were icy because they didn't always resurface them. Now they do, and we find that there's a little variation in the court speed here at the Billie Jean King National Tennis Center. Top players that I'm talking to say that Ashe is a little slower than Armstrong and Grandstand. So there's a little bit of variety, but this tournament has gone through quite a few phases. But when I first experienced it as a junior here in 1987, the courts were like playing on glass. They were really quick, really low bouncing. Nowadays, as you'll watch the matches at this year's U.S. Open, it seems quite comfortable for the players to catch up to the ball, to play defense, and very difficult to serve and volley.
This change in court speed, do you think it's affected how the players choose their strings and equipment, their rackets?
Oh, it's all tied together, Justin. Everything works. For the players, it's all about what can I do to maximize whatever conditions I'm playing in. If you're playing in hotter weather, you have to string your rackets a little tighter to control the ball typically. The cooler weather, you're stringing them looser. And when you're playing on a court that's a little bit slower, you have to be prepared physically for longer rallies. And that may mean more wear and tear on your arm. That may mean that you want your racket to be a little looser so you get more out of it. Like we saw Andy Roddick in his final tournament here, he was dropping his tension as the tournament went on because his arm was getting worn out from the exertion. So there are a lot of factors, and the technology is very important for the players. You see them tweaking their strings. You don't see them tweaking the weight and balance of their rackets as frequently as that, but the string tension is a big variable.
The slower courts, the new strings, the new rackets, I mean, is all this good for the game?
Well, I think it's great for the game at home. I think for the average player, it becomes easier. You can use rackets that have a big sweet spot. You can use these strings that allow you to control the ball more. So I think for the amateur, it's absolutely wonderful. And I think for the pros, it's been also terrific. I think the quality of tennis that we're seeing, the ability for the players to stay in these rallies, makes for very appealing tennis. I lived through an era in my professional career on the ATP Tour where the public, via the media, was complaining that the points were too short and they weren't seeing enough rallies. They were watching Pete Sampras and Goran Ivanisevic and Michael Stick, Richard Krajicek, Boris Becker serve, and that was about it. I mean, they're great servers, and it was tough to stop them on faster courts, quicker, lighter balls. So there's been a concerted effort by the powers that be to try and make tennis more appealing to our consumer, and I think we've succeeded on that front. I think just looking back to the match that I watched last night between Del Potro and Djokovic, these rallies were so physically bruising and taxing and utterly unbelievable to the audience. So you had standing ovations for a rally at 3-all in the second set and an audience of 23,000. I mean, that's pretty special.